solen glimmer i aldrig så långsammare och
We are living way beyond our means.
Welcome to Irish History. Now let's get into today's topic. During the 19th century in Ireland, famines and fever epidemics were common and brought with it thousands of deaths, of which all classes were affected, but the poor suffered the most. The most common complaint was typhus, but also there was cholera, relapsing fever, dysentery, scurvy, and smallpox. Not a year went by when some sort of an epidemic broke out in some part of the country. Even though fevers brought death, it also brought awareness of the problem of health, cleanliness, and sanitation. In response to the widespread deaths from fever, the government took action. New legislative and administrative measures will be put in place to deal with these problems. While fever epidemics were common, it can't be explained by any single cause in the social structure of the time in Irish society. But Robert Peel summed up the causes in 1818: one, universal lack of employment and poverty; two, defective quality and quantity of food, which was a scarcity in 1816-1819. 3. The persistent wet weather and lack of fuel. 4. Presence of beggars throughout the country. And 5. Attending wakes and funerals who had died of the fever. And these causes were repeated again and again. The spread of disease during the 1822 famine, a potato famine, was reportedly caused by crowded apartments, attended wakes and funerals, collecting manure about houses, and wandering beggars. Another common occurrence were minor famines, which brought its own outbreak of fever. While the connection between scarcity of food and fever made the poor weak, it really did let them be at the mercy of the disease. A doctor wrote, "The close connection that exists between famine and fever is so clearly demonstrated by every historic record as not to require any additional proof. That connection has been already pointed out in the several instances of epidemic fever in 1741, 1801, and 1817. And this shows the connection between fever and famine was understood. In 1831, the head of the Coast Guard, Sir James Dunbrane, had warned the Irish Chief Secretary warm weather would sweep away thousands in Donegal, as they were suffering already with skin eruptions and dysentery due to their diet eating seaweed. As unemployment was seen as an important factor of spreading the fever, a select committee of the Commons investigated the 1816-1819 typhus epidemic and devoted almost the entire report to devise schemes to provide work. It was the collapse of the textile industry which caused the fever outbreak in Dublin in 1826, apparently. The Poor Employment Act was introduced in 1817, and with the reorganization and expansion of the Board of Works in 1831, and further attempts were made to combat the problem. Of course, the problem isn't that clear cut for a quick and easy solution, and the problem persisted throughout the 19th century for successive governments and parliamentary committees. In June 1822, Dr. O'Connell blamed lack of employment for the fever in Listowel in County Kerry, and many felt like Peel in 1818. Unemployment was one of the chief causes of the epidemic which was happening at the time, the typhus epidemic. The wet seasons, which did cause a shortage of food in this period, also caused turf famines, which was also a source of the misery. Peel wrote in October 1816, "The great comfort of the Irish peasant has hitherto been the abundant supply of fuel which he commands in winter. It makes amends for the wretchedness of his hovel, and the want of clothing. But this year very little turf has been saved, and it is now so thoroughly wet that it would require several days' continuance of fine weather to bring it into a state which it could be used. If there is a severe winter, the want of fuel will be greater source of misery than the want of food." The absence of fire and hot water created the condition of breeding typhus disease. The poor had no means to heat themselves, and no hot water, nor to wash their clothes, which they usually wear day and night. Huddling together for mutual warmth in squalor, they became infested with vermin. Mrs. Croby of Ardforth, County Kerry, said in 1822 she became an absentee to avoid witnessing the people in distress from want of clothes and bedclothes. The rags on their backs were used to barter, and in doing so spread the disease. In many places, people were forced to eat seaweed, wild mustard, nettles, and dock leaves. With no hot water to boil these wild plants, they were eating it raw and brought diarrhea and dysentery. Vagrants and beggars were often regarded as being one of the main causes for the spread of the contagion. The fear of contagion spreading made people fear and adopt a siege mentality. During the cholera epidemic in the 1830s, the fear of being infected by a wandering beggar was so great, special constables were employed to keep the beggars from entering certain towns. Every year, laborers in their thousands would travel in search of harvest work from one part of the country to the other, while their wives and families were forced to abandon their homes and beg door to door just to make a living. A doctor from Berwick, County Tipperary, reported in June 1822 a great number of mendicants from Clare, Mayo, and Galway caused the spread of the disease. Workers who were from Connacht usually travelled to Meath and Dublin, but those from Clare travelled to areas around Kilkenny, while the labourers from poor areas of County Derry went to Antrim and Down. But to add to the human traffic, seasonal labourers, mainly from Connacht and Ulster, would go to the ports of Derry, Belfast, Drogheda, and Dublin to migrate to Britain. During minor famines, mendicity was encouraged by Irish traditional hospitality to the beggars and the poor. In 1822, mendicants, searching for relief, became numerous in Galway. They were shipped by boat to Roundstone and other ports to Connemara to clear the city. Poverty grew in Dublin to an alarming extent, and the city was plagued with beggars. While in Castlebar, County Mayo, overcrowding in dirty lanes spread the fever in 1822, and because of the issue of mendicity, like unemployment, there was no ready-made solution. In 1819, a committee put forward recommendations, but didn't remedy the issue. Also, many statutes were introduced, but most were unenforceable because of the absence of an effective poor law system. Another factor that was instrumental in spreading the disease was the tradition of waking the dead. The custom of attending wakes, like showing hospitality to the beggars, is a time-sacred tradition, and during the epidemics people were reluctant to renounce it while under pressure by the church and British government. Peel said no persuasion would induce them to shut their door against the wandering beggar. or to refuse to pay the last sad tribute to the remains of their friends and kindred, a tribute they regarded with peculiar veneration. In Ireland, no fear contagion, no fear of death could operate to induce the people to forego habits and feelings which they cherish. The government during January 1818 was warned by one of the army surgeons who had just completed an inspection tour in the north that wakes of people who died of fever were common, and stated, always thought necessary by the lower orders to attend in considerable numbers, this in filthy cabins with no air. In February 1818, the government issued a public appeal to suspend the practices, only for a few months, and similar appeals in 1832 for all occasions when fever occurred. But these appeals went on deaf ears until consequences became apparent. Catholic bishops opposed the wakes during these epidemics, but people took little heed to them. The wake in the 19th century wasn't just about honoring the dead, but also a social event with drinking, gossip, and dancing. One contemporary wrote, their attachments to this custom is so strong as frequently to expose them to great danger. No apprehension of infection from their most malignant disease being sufficient to prevent their crowding into the house of the deceased. Other difficulties, the poor in pre-hunger Ireland were housed in conditions which spread the disease. As the population rose during the pre-hunger, housing became a problem. In 1841, 40% of houses in Ireland were one-room cabins, while 37% were between 2 to 4 rooms. The poor in towns and cities often lived in overcrowded squalid rooms. In the towns, the window tax, not so fondly known as typhus tax, firstly introduced in 1799 for a wartime expedient, was extended by new legislation in 1816 and was blamed for the worse conditions as windows were boarded up and the home was darker and dirtier, but eventually the tax was abolished. Another known cause of the fever is poverty, which made resistance to the disease minimal and the spread easy. 2 million people were partly dependent on charity to survive year to year, and during periods of crop failure, disease and industrial distress which increased in number. These circumstances, a considerable proportion of the population had no hope of good food, warm clothing, and adequate housing. Some medical aid was available for the poor. Like in 1815, medical agencies received support from the government, like dispensaries, infirmaries, houses of industry, fever hospitals, and lunatic asylums. Houses of industry started in the 18th century and were founded to deal with frequency and medicity. The first houses were established in Dublin 1773, Belfast 74, Limerick and Coleraine in 76, Cork 78 and Lisburn in 1780. The fever and famine in 1771 created a critical situation in Ireland for the poor, and it underlined the need for the provision of medical relief. The pressure on these institutions, like the Dublin House, was forced to extend the services and built its own fever hospital in 1801, which was opened in 1803. Lunatics were also accommodated in these special cells, and over 230 lunatics were housed between Cork, Dublin, Waterford, and Limerick in 1804. Overcrowding soon created the need for lunatic asylums. But as any other medical institution, legislative measures empowered the grand juries to set up lunatic asylums, but didn't happen till a grant was given to Richmond Lunatic Asylum in 1810 and was opened in 1815. In 1817, the Committee on the Lunatic Poor reported the Lord Lieutenant is enabled by statute to build asylums where he considers necessary, and the costs were to be met by grand jury. But in 1827, 7 asylums were built and accommodated 800 patients. Dispensaries had started in the 18th century, but by the beginning of the 19th century, legislation improved the role of dispensaries by giving free medical advice and medical assistance to the poor. This was done by voluntary subscriptions. But also with legislation, grand juries were enabled to match voluntary subscriptions with similar grants from their presidents. While this was a service to the whole community, it had one drawback: an area with no resident gentry. It was almost impossible to raise subscriptions that would be sufficient to start a dispensary. And here be the issue of absenteeism. It would be felt, because even grand juries were also controlled by the gentry, and it would have made things difficult to have presidents made for remote areas. One area in County Cork, letters were sent to non-resident landowners for aid to start a dispensary, but there was no reply to these letters. Even a resident Protestant clergy tried. With the increase in occurrence of fever and total amount of aid given to dispensaries by grand juries grew during the period of 1815 to 35, and the dispensary system expanded. In 1833, 450 dispensaries were established, but in 1845, 632 were just short by 20 for the whole country. In County Louth, 2 dispensaries were opened in 1805 in Ardee and Cullen, and in 1835 there was 10: Ardee, Ballymascallan, Cullen, Carlingford, Castlebellingham, Dunleer, Dundalk, Drogheda, Louth, and Termonfeckin. In County Meath, new dispensaries were opened in Slane 1808, Trim 1811, Acker 1812, Crossakiel 1814, Kells 1815, Dunboyne 1817, Drumconrath 1817, Summerhill 1817, Rathove 1818, Oldcastle 1818, Attleboy 1819, Ballylavor 1819, Clonard 1822, Kilmainham Wood 1826, Stalmullen 1828, Julianstown 1829, Bellowstown 1829, Dulick 1831, and Black Lion in 1831. The dispensaries were quite effective and helped the suffering in the immediate areas, and when epidemics occurred, it provided much needed relief from qualified personnel. But there were too few dispensaries, and some had no qualified doctors, or doctors were too far away, and at some dispensaries, unlike the one in Ardee, medical aid was not given outside the building, and local dispensary rules sometimes exclude deserving cases from aid. Perhaps the voluntary system was the greatest disadvantage of financing. Without the gentry, it was impossible to raise subscriptions, and even though grand juries were by law to subscribe, they weren't forced to do so. In 1765, an act made the clergy of the established church a perpetual corporation for the erection of infirmaries, and by 1804, almost every county in Ireland had an infirmary. Like dispensaries, it was financed by voluntary subscription and grand jury presidents, but by 1830, infirmaries received £3,000 per annum from grand jury presidents. The very first fever hospitals in Ireland were in the late 18th, early 19th centuries, and they were few in number and only situated in larger towns and cities like Dublin, Belfast, Limerick, Killala, Waterford, Kilkenny, and Derry. Early 1807 legislation passed to encourage the building of fever hospitals in every part of the country, and by the act of the same year, grand juries were empowered to raise the sum of £100 for the support of fever hospitals. But the sum of money was inadequate, and in 1814 the sum was increased to £250, but is still far short of the amount required to build a sizable hospital. Also, grand juries in some counties were reluctant to make precedents for fever hospitals. This seems to be the case in the provinces of Connacht and Ulster, where the growing numbers of fever hospitals was slow, while in Munster and Leinster it wasn't. In 1835, 70 fever hospitals were built, while in 1845 there was 101. These hospitals were built out of necessity of crisis of epidemics rather than deliberate governmental policy, and because of necessities, Dublin was better provided for hospitals and medical establishments for relief rather than the rest of the country. Large number of these voluntary hospitals were founded by bequests in the 18th century, and many only receive occasional assistance, which these hospitals constantly sought from the government. This is how well established Dublin was with assistance for improving the relief for the sick. In 1804, Cork Street Fever Hospital in Dublin was opened with 80 beds, but for emergency there can be 120, while in 1809 the beds were increased to 140, and with the typhus epidemic 1817 the number of beds was raised to 240. The Dublin House of Industry Hospital, the Hardwick, was for paupers, although in times of emergency it can be opened for the general public. Many people were reluctant to avail themselves of facilities provided by the Poorhouse Hospital. Another hospital belonging to the Dublin House Industry was Whitworth and opened in time for the influx of the 1817 typhus epidemic. During these fever epidemics, many general hospitals would also open their doors to the fever patients. The ratio of support from the government and support from other medical institutions is roughly 1-4. But it wasn't the complete picture of the government involved in public health as medical examinations might suggest, because fever epidemics had the government been more involved in the public health of Ireland. The worst epidemic was in 1817 and 1819 because it marked the extent of the typhus epidemic throughout the country, but it isn't possible to say what date the fever became widespread. In Killala, County Mayo, the fever began in September 1816, but in another part of the country, the epidemic showed up in County Wexford in late August 1818. But in 1817, the epidemic hit most of the country in spring or summer. But the epidemic had reached its peak in 1818 and began to decline in spring 1819. In Cork City, 1/7 of the population was affected and 2 fever hospitals opened. Waterford was badly affected, with 1 person out of every 7 contracted the fever in the city. In County Kerry, the whole county was affected, and many people took to the roads, and it seemed the whole county was in motion. In Limerick, the fever was severe. St. John's Hospital was overcrowded, and the government had to open a military hospital for civilian patients. In Tipperary, dysentery was a serious problem, with Clonmel being hit the most, but all other fevers were short in the county. Dr. Crampton inspected Connacht and County Clare, declared the whole area was stricken with the fever. The towns were badly affected, but so was the remote areas of Iris and Connemara. The Gladdock district in Galway City was contaminated because of insanitary conditions and spread to the whole city. The effects of the fever wasn't as severe in Clare than in Galway. Since Ennis, in County Clare, the inhabitants were recommended for following the law of hygiene. But Crampton wasn't particularly happy with Mayo towns. Sligo and Roscommon were fortunate in having new fever hospitals, but Leitrim had to rely on the county infirmary for medicine. In Ulster, the typhus epidemic level reached quicker than other provinces, but declined as quickly too, with the duration only lasting about a year and a half. The epidemic began in County Down in October 1816, but in Antrim, including Belfast and Lisburn, were unaffected until July 1817. Medicants in Armagh spread to all classes, and Monaghan broke out in Gaul. The inhabitants in the mountainous region of Pomeroy in County Tyrone quitted their homes, crowded into the towns, and brought filth and infection along with them. An official inspector reported fever in Donegal and Fermanagh, and Cavan was less prevalent than in the rest of the province. A doctor estimated the number of patients in Donegal was 15,000, with 1,500 dying from the epidemic. Dr. Cheney inspecting Leinster blamed absentee landlords for the misery of the poor during the epidemic. In Carlow, Kilkenny, Queen's County, current day Offaly, and Kildare, the fever, which had been smoldering among the poor for 20 years, became an epidemic during the winter of 1816-1817. Along with food shortage, poor weather with heavy rain, and poor harvests of 1816 brought further misery for the poor. Dr. Cheney also reported when the epidemic began, the poor was eating wild plants, while in Kilkenny they were feeding on hops, nettletops, and other weeds. In Meath and Louth, the fever became more widespread in May, and in 1817 disappeared apparently when employment became plentiful with the arrival of the linen trade in 1818. Dublin escaped the epidemic until September 1817 and only abated until December 1819. The typhus epidemic 1816-1819 was the worst epidemic of the period, with Harty estimating 44,300 died of 737,000 sick of the fever, but Barker and Cheney, who had access to official reports, estimated 1.5 million affected. 1.5 million affected with 65,000 dead. But the deaths could be higher because the official reports state who was registered in the hospital as patients, but there were those who didn't go to the hospital and were unregistered. The governors of the House of Industry were asked to examine the extent of the fever in the city, with the doctors Barker and Cheney were selected for this work. Dublin and the surrounding area was divided into 4 sections and a medical inspector appointed in each area. Also, the streets were cleaned and houses whitewashed, and the sick were encouraged to go to hospital. By the end of September 1817, admissions to the fever hospitals rose to 796 and continued to rise by March 1818. The number was 1,712 to 3,000 in October 1818, and it was the peak month for the fever. In January 1819, admissions started to drop from 2,394 to 996 in June 1819. In October 1819, it was reported to be normal and the epidemic was over, with the National Fever Committee being dissolved. The National Fever Committee was formed on 30th September 1817 by Peel and appointed 3 people to the committee: Dr. Rennie, Dr. William Disney, and Reverend James Horner. The National Fever Committee's proposal was to examine the applications for aid and issue such sums to the government. Even though the government has the willingness to help, it was restricted to aid local contributions. As Peel was careful to point out to the press, the interference of the government must necessarily be limited to those cases wherein it shall appear from written documents that fever is still prevalent to an unusual extent, and that hospitals have been opened and accommodation provided for the relief of the sick by means of subscriptions of the wealthier part of the country. Within 2 years, the National Fever Committee forked out £18,628, 17 shillings and 6 pence, in small amounts in various parts of the country. Some villages received £25, while larger towns and cities received between £300 and £800. The province of Connacht received £1,400. Galway City got £150, while Westport, half the size of Galway City, received £50 extra, and probably because of the influence of the Marquis of Sligo, who took interest in the welfare of the town. In Wicklow, the Ardborough family are probably responsible for obtaining £320 for the inhabitants of Stratford-on-Slaney. £1,000 went to Waterford City because Sir John Newport MP, who is MP of the city, was also a friend of Peel. But the investigation of the epidemic happened because of Newport when he raised the issue in Parliament 22nd April 1818, and in early May 1818 a committee reported on recommendations and the act for it was passed, and on the 13th of May 1818 the main provisions of the act were mainly to set up local boards of health and create fever hospitals, special corporations established to collect funds, and grand juries empowered to make presentments equal to twice the amount raised by private subscriptions. Also, the act is to open 8 new fever hospitals in the county during the typhus. Also, the act is to open 8 new fever hospitals in the country during the typhus epidemic. The local boards of health were to deal with local epidemics, and their extensive powers included cleaning streets, lanes, yards, and fumigating and whitewashing infected houses, destroying infected beds and bedding, open windows, and take any other measures of ventilation. The Board of Health could be convened at one or more magistrates in any city, town, and district, and the members to be chosen by the staff of local fever hospitals or dispensaries. But if none exist, then they are chosen by the respectable parishioners of the district. Grand juries were also responsible for some of the expenses of the local boards of health. The legislation was of great significance, parliamentary step to be a major help for the poor in Ireland. Local boards of health were used to combat all major outbreaks of fever during the Great Hunger. The cholera breakout in 1832 brought fresh legislation, but the 1818 Act was still the keystone of the policy. But like anything that was created, there is opposition, and opposition started at the very beginning of the local board of health. A second select committee was created in April 1819 by Newport instigation, and it reported the local board of health appeared to have cited in some way unmerited fear and jealousy. This was raised because of apparent expense and restraints the local board of health imposed. This opposition lasted throughout this period, but appointing local boards continued. But the 1819 report by the Select Committee of Fever approved of the idea of setting up the boards of health, but it has to be cases of need. The Second Fever Act, 14th of June 1819, enabled the officers of health to be established and parishes and provisions to be levied by the health tax by said parishes. The Select Committee on Fever was also concerned with vagrants, and their recommendations also became law in 1819, with the magistrates being empowered to expel vagrants from their own districts and send them to prison for 24 hours, so the vagrants will also be cleaned, but also their clothes. With the absence of the poor law, there was little chance of enforcing any vagrancy law. This legislation enabled local boards of health and parish officers of health to be appointed, and it was sufficient in creating medical relief administration. In March 1820, the General Board of Health was created for the entire country, and it became the permanent body, which was unique at the time. The role of the General Board of Health acted as a watchdog to collect stats of local health conditions and advise the administrators and local boards of health for to combat occasional epidemics and when and where grants to hospitals should be made. The establishment of the General Board of Health was a major step to centralization medical relief. In 1822, the potato famine hit the west and south of the country, with fever spreading rapidly in June, but disappeared the following December. The Board of Health gathered stats and found the fever was in Mayo, Galway, where it lasted the longest. Other counties affected Clare, Kerry, Roscommon, and Sligo. But when new crops restored, the full supply of the fever seems to pass. The fever still affected areas differently. Like in Boyle County, Roscommon, the fever was mild, but in Sligo it was severe. In Mayo, it was reported fever and dysentery was at an alarming extent in Ballinrobe and Newport, Cong and Killala were unaffected. In Galway, the towns and cities were badly affected and many deaths were reported in Connemara. In other parts of the county, Hertford and its neighbourhood was unaffected by the fever. Erris was the worst hit, with the fever being reported in 255 deaths in June 1822, and it was also reported the poor in Erris' diet was reduced to eating rotten fish, seaweed and nettles. While in County Clare, Ennis had an outbreak, and in Listowel the fever was threatening to be similar to the 1816-1819 epidemic. In early summer 1822, very few reports were reaching the government about the fever. These kinds of reports were expected to be brought to the government because, as I have mentioned in the early parts of the video, fever and famine was understood as a cause and effect. Dr. Rennie was a commissioner and wrote in June 1822, "We must certainly be prepared to expect that in the counties Mayo, Galway, Clare, Kerry, and parts of the county of Cork, where the inhabitants at large would starve and die in hundreds and thousands, was enough for the relief afforded by government aided by the liberty of the British public. Acute diseases most form part of the general distress, as all experience proves that they follow one another as cause and effect." Eventually, the reports reached the government, and the Board of Health collected the details and advised the Government Emergency Relief Committee on what action should be taken. In Clare, the County Relief Committee erected structures in each barony of the county, and also in Galway. Dr. Whistler used the fever grant to build a permanent infirmary with the aid of a Protestant archbishop from Tuam. In some parts of Mayo and Galway, there were no doctors, so the Board of Health sent doctors from Dublin. The first report from the Board of Health contained rules for the prevention of fever and plans to set up temporary fever hospitals in remote areas for a short time at a moderate expense. During 1822, £8,414 was distributed, and together with the famine relief scheme, the fever was prevented from extending to 1823. Comparing the fever epidemic of 1816, 1819, and 1822, the fever was small in 1822, but there was controversy in 1822 to the extent of the fever, as Dr. Rennie writes. Several instances which accounts have been set up to the Board of Health, apparently well authenticated, of the extensive spread of fever in particular places, and grants of money were made thereon accompanied with medical instructions. It has turned out upon subsequent inquiry that scarcely any fever existed in the places alluded to. But the cause of the reports was to obtain relief for the poor, a relief which was given more speedily when representations were made for the fever aid. But fever did exist, and it continued even past harvest time. The famine stopped in August, but the grants for fever relief continued until late November. The Board of Health kept a watchful eye on public health, especially in Dublin. The Irish Under-Secretary get regular reports like one sent to Gregory in May 1824. Judging from the collective reports of the different hospitals receiving fever patients, of which a synoptical view for the last 5 weeks ending May 7th is enclosed, the General Board of Health are of opinion that no increase of fever of any importance as of late occurred in Dublin or its neighbourhood. The number of admissions to the hospitals during 4 weeks ended April 9th amounting to 471, and during 4 weeks ended May 7th amounting to 480. A number not exceeding the average of the years 1813, 14 and 15. The hospitals have, however, remained full during the last 2 months, and the admissions of a few patients has been for a short time delayed. Under the circumstances, the General Board of Health begged leave to propose that the governors of the fever hospitals in Cork Street be empowered to increase the number of their beds for fever patients from 180 to 220, measure which we have reason to believe the governors of the hospital will readily adopt to meet any future emergency. Dr. Percival has attended at the board and reported on the state of fever in Donnybrook and its neighbourhood, and from inquiry made by the General Board of Health, it appears that fever does not prevail in that quarter. In 1826, another epidemic occurred, and apparently this fever affected the textile industry in Dublin, Belfast and Cork. In October 1826, there were over 6,000 patients, and the epidemic lasted from the summer in 1826 to summer 1827 in Dublin. Throughout the epidemic, the Board of Health made regular reports, and the Irish Chief Secretary, Goulburn, reported to Peel and informed him how provisions would need to be made for the poor. Peel, who had experienced the 1816, 1819 and 1822 epidemics, authorized expenditure of £4,000 for medical purposes. Work began on extending the fever hospitals in Dublin, and Goulburn reported nunnery and an encampment was taken over for 400 additional patients. But outside of Dublin, the local Board of Health set up fever hospitals in Wexford and Cork. But the government's main aim was Dublin in 1826, and other parts of the country had to rely on local institutions and once again on voluntary relief organizations. Goulburn claimed in October 1826 that relief is costing the government £120 a day, and the fever continued from September to March and April, so the cost should be in the region of £25,000 or £30,000, but the only figure mentioned in 1827 is £15,792, used to combat the fever in Ireland. But since the government concern was Dublin, it was probably the total expenditure that was used to maintain the fever hospital during the 9 months. And even then, only a quarter of the population of Dublin was being helped with the fever. So one could only guess what it was like in other towns and cities in other parts of the country outside of Dublin. In 1829-31, there was a scarcity of food, but in Galway and Mayo, 1831, the combined number of people, 326,532, needed help. But worse was to come to Ireland in 1832. It was already affecting Europe at St. Petersburg, 1829, but came to Russia earlier in 1817, German towns in 1830, and November 8 in England, and was also in India in the early years of the 19th century. But this disease was the primer epidemic, cholera. This disease was so terrifying there was a high mortality rate of people getting affected by it, and those who do are carriers, and once someone has it, the death rate was 76%, because the death will follow in 12 hours, and in Ireland 1832, 40% of people died of it. The Irish Board of Health described the symptoms of cholera as great laxity of the bowels, often with vomiting, the matter discharged, resembling whey, tin gruel, or barley water. Depression of the vital powers, indicated by loss of strength, weaknesses of voice, reduction of the pulse and of the natural heat of the body, the features becoming sharp and contracted, the eyes sunk, with a vivid or dark line around them, cramps beginning at the toes or tips of the fingers, gradually but rapidly approaching the body. Sometimes the lips, face, neck, hands, feet, or the whole surface of the body assuming a leaden, blue or purple color, the skin on the hands and feet becoming wrinkled, the surface of the body cold, damp, and clammy, the tongue moist, often white and loaded, but always flappy and chilled, like a piece of dead fish. It can be understated to say the fear and terror the people of Ireland had of contracting cholera, but didn't stop people having wakes, and because of it, the disease spread quickly. When cholera came to Ireland, it was first reported in Belfast on the 18th of March, then came to Dublin on 25th of March, and newspapers giving daily reports telling how many are affected with cholera. Keep that in mind for later. The Board of Health during the cholera epidemic was called the Cholera Board. Before the 2nd of May, 430 died. By 5th of July, 1524. By Christmas, 1832, 4,478. But it didn't spread quickly to other parts of the country. Like on the 12th of April, it hit Cork. On the 28th, Tralee. 12th of May, Galway. 14th, Limerick. 20th, Waterford. And by August, it was in Wexford and Derry. Eventually, the cholera seemed to have passed, until reappearing in Mohill twice, 1833 in Leitrim, Newcastle County Limerick, had a second outbreak in January 1833, and in Bruff in January 1834, with a report of 16 deaths. In 1831, English doctors, legislators, administrators, and the public were keeping watch of the approach of the cholera, and literature about it was published because 2 English doctors were sent to Russia to study the epidemic and had the Russian report translated to English. In Ireland, administrators were keeping a close eye of the impending approach of the cholera epidemic, but the Lord Lieutenant ordered on the 27th of October in 1831 a report that the Board of Health in Dublin should communicate to the country at large. The report, first published by the English Cholera Board, contained measures which are to be adopted in Ireland should cholera come to Ireland. The Lord Lieutenant called on everyone to cooperate and announced that government would be willing to help. When the outbreak happened in Ireland, the government relief effort began from the legislation framework of the Relief Acts 1818 and 1819, with the establishment of the local boards of health and officers of health in certain parishes for a limited time. The Cholera Board preferred the local boards of health because they would consist of a greater number of people to help, but the real reason is because of the expensive place on the county the local board is established in. On 31st of March 1832, Cholera Board had their first meeting on the reality of cholera in the country, while on the 13th of April a proclamation was issued and displayed all over the country. And on the proclamation it mentions the symptoms and what to do if affected. Go to get medical help, or if they don't, they die. Also mentioned on the proclamation, the Central Board of Health for Ireland has recommended the formation of boards of health under 58 George 3rd, Chapter 47 for towns, cities, or districts, as the case may require. The appointment of places for advice and medicine can at all hours be obtained with as little delay as possible, and the establishment of small hospitals to which the sick can be removed with all possible expedition, for which purpose suitable wheel carriages or litters should be provided. Where hospitals are established supported by public funds, which is expected that the medical attendants will furnish to the Central Board of Health for Ireland a daily account of the cases either received in the hospital or occurring in their neighbourhood, according to a stated form. The poor have long been acquainted with the value of hospital assistance, and it is hoped they will alacrity themselves of that now offered for the relief of this disease, which, if not at once met by judicious medical treatment, often in a few hours terminates the death. In the existing crowded state of the houses and rooms occupied by the poor, safety can be hoped for only by the speedy removal to hospital of the person attacked and by the following precautions after the removal of the sick. The windows of the apartment should be thrown open and remain freely admitting the air for 3 days, but not during the night time. The floor of the apartment and the passages leading thereto should be scraped, if necessary, and well washed. And, lastly, lime washed with a mixture of freshly slacked quicklime and water. Free ventilation being at the same time adopted that the apartment may soon become dry. Any recommendation of the medical inspector or of the officers of health on this head should be duly attended to. The straw of all bedding in the room should, with as little delay as possible, be removed and burned, and fresh straw provided. Drawers, chests, or presses should be emptied of their contents, and every article of clothing contained in them immersed in water, and subjected to such processes as may be pointed out by the medical inspector. Persons who have labored under cholera are strongly advised not to visit in a family or to go to a place of worship or any crowded assembly for at least 14 days after recovery, as it is a prevailing opinion in places which have suffered from the disease that more danger arises from the recently dead body than from the contact with or attendance on a patient in cholera. No time should be lost after death takes in wrapping the corpse in tar cloth and having it removed for interment, and it has been deemed a necessary measure of the safety that the grave should be about 6 feet deep. Wakes of persons dying of cholera should not take place, and, as far as possible, should be prevented. The Cholera Board advise keep it warm, dress it well, eating well, cooked food, and avoiding sleep on bare ground. Also, the proclamation was the government signal that action must be taken and shows how little doctors of the time knew of the nature of cholera. Yet the recommendations, if adopted, properly restrict the spread of the disease. As the epidemic spread, local boards were organized and many local boards were formed to keep the disease away from the local area. Local landlords like Lord Clonbrook and Sir Ross Mahon whitewashed their tenants' houses, and clergymen who were Catholic and Protestant contribute 100 barrels of lime to help. Although the people were moving, relief can be easily accessed and away from affected areas. It was reported many people left Drogheda because of how the fear of cholera was prevailing in the town. They moved to Dublin, as did people from Wexford and Wicklow moved through Bray on to Dublin, while the Limerick Boards of Health reported a mass movement from Kerry. Before aid was granted, the Cholera Board insisted forms had to be filled out, and there were thousands of applications. And because of these forms, the board would gather information on cholera cases and deaths, local conditions, employment, and landlords. With the forms approved, the money would be sent to the local boards and be used to finance cholera hospitals, doctors, and medical attendants, compensate people for destroyed clothes and furniture, prevent contagion, and recommendations of the cholera board, and some other part of the finance was used to purchase food for the poor. At the outbreak of cholera in Ireland, the Cholera Board also employed additional doctors, but they were mainly employed in Dublin, working in large fever hospitals. But the doctors were also sent to other areas where cholera is severe, like Dr. Stevens to Drogheda, Dr. Brown to Galway, Dr. Osborne to Castlebar, and Drs. Ferguson and Reid to Ennis. This was an attempt to give medical aid and advice to areas where doctors are scarce and patient numbers are high, and the expenses incurred by the doctors had to be met by the local boards of health. The quarantine question always arose when cholera or other epidemics happened, but quarantine restrictions were imposed on ships coming from ports where disease to have existed. Even ships from the ports of Turkey and Africa were suspected of having cholera. In 1830, the Privy Council took responsibility for quarantine control since the local custom board in Dublin was abolished. In January 1832, quarantine was announced on all ships from Glasgow because cholera appeared in Kirkintilloch, near the city. Afterwards, the English Privy Council Secretary wrote the Irish Customs Board and told them any ship with cholera should be ordered to one of the Foul Bill quarantine stations in Milford Haven, Standgate Creek, and the 5th of Firth, the hospital ships, which was also recommended temporary hospital ships at Cork, Belfast, or Dublin. Orders were given to vessels from Alexandria if anyone is plague-ridden, they are to immediately go to a quarantine station. Because of the disruption of trade by the cholera epidemic, the newspaper companies were forced to not report about cholera because in Dublin, traders were worried their ships arrive at their destination, they would be put in quarantine. One newspaper stood its ground and reported all cholera outbreaks. On 12 April 1832, quarantine was imposed on ships coming to Dublin from Liverpool, while the Dublin Chamber of Commerce sent a letter to the government to persuade them to remove quarantine, while Cork and Newry were also called foul ports. Eventually, the restrictions were removed on April the 19th. The removal probably happened because the Cholera Board persuaded doctors to examine when ships arrived at port, and medical attendants would be on the ships going to and from port. The Cholera Board compiled a number of cholera cases and deaths from the 1841 census, recording 46,175 died between 1832 to 34. Also, a manuscript record in 1832 of 51,153 affected by cholera, with whom 18,955 died. But many rural areas were affected by the disease, and some of these areas had no board of health, so the true stat of the number of affected and death went unrecorded, and added many were fleeing from the epidemic to nearest town or aid or county for medical aid, and probably many more died at home. So 46,175 is a conservative estimation. Many businesses also closed down, like 2 distilleries and a brewery in Athlone because of the outbreak, and left many labourers out of work. In Balbriggan, 2 cotton mills closed because they couldn't get cotton from Liverpool, and remained closed to stop the spread among the crowd. People were also scared to eat fish or cockles, and because of this, even fishermen from Hove were losing money. While in other areas of Dublin, paper mills and woolen factories closed down. Even the poor at Blackrock were losing money from people not sea bathing. Country towns were bad too, like Sligo inhabitants fled from town just within a few days when cholera broke out. The wealthy families stayed in small rooms in the country costing 40 or 50 pounds, while the poor lived under a canvas. Castlebar was deserted, while the Board of Health whitewashed the homes and covered the street with lime, and other towns were the same. The Cholera Board distributed 143,013 pounds, 5 shillings and 7 pounds to local boards of health and officers of health in 1832. The Board of Health self-praised themselves by saying, "Viewing the progress of this vulnerable malady over the globe and taking into consideration in how much larger proportion the inhabitants of other communities have suffered, for the number of individuals reported to have undergone an attack of cholera in Ireland has scarcely amounted to 1 in 120 of its whole population." Reflecting also on the peculiar circumstances of Ireland as connected with modes and habits of living of the lower classes of its inhabitants, the crowded state of the dwellings and other circumstances favoring the extension of the epidemic disease, the Cholera Board forbore to assign much infancy to the means adopted under the sanction and guidance of the Lord Lieutenant, and to deduce the inference that the progress of this extraordinary visitation has been greatly impeded or prevented. But the disease in Ireland was very high despite the claims by the board, while in England it was estimated as being 1 in every 250, or less than half the population in Ireland. Dublin suffered more than London, and deaths in England and Wales amounted to 16,437 than the 18,995 who died in the first 9 months in Ireland. The crop failure has reduced large areas in the countryside to starvation level, and towns had their industries collapsed. With the undernourished contracting the disease and the death rate high, the cholera epidemic in the 1830s showed how serious poverty was in this country. After cholera outbreak, there were no major epidemics on a national scale before 1845, and in many towns and cities in Munster, another fever broke out in 1836. In Cork, the fever reached the highest level since 1826-27, and also Limerick, Thurles, Ennis, Cashel, and Killarney all report the increase of the fever. In 1837, a third year of a famine in Donegal, the Rutland area was affected with fever, and also in Dublin, with signs of it increasing. During the famine in the south 1839 and the west in 1842, fever was reported. Local fever epidemics were reported in Galway 1828 and 1844, while in Cork cholera struck again in 1839, and fever epidemics were rarely far from people's minds. The admissions for Ennis Fever Hospital in 1829-1831 was 573 to 1,618 in 1836. In the decade before 1845, the Board of Health continued in coordinating medical relief schemes. Like in 1837, the board donated £5,529 to Dublin hospitals to increase accommodation of the fever patients, and in the same year, Dr. Stevens went to Rutland in Donegal to give medical aid, but he soon found the real issue: the people were suffering of hunger, not fever, and he stayed to give out meal rather medical aid. In 1839, Captain Chads organized the government famine relief scheme because of the famine fever, which was to make grants for fever victims, which was used again in 1842, and it was one of the last minor famine before 1845. During the 1840s, the Irish system of medical relief was criticized, and the Committee on Medical Charities During the 1840s, the Irish system of Medical relief was criticized, and the Committee on Medical Charities advocated for the abolition of the Board of Health in 1843 and recommended a new board to deal with medical charities, as did the Second Parliament concession in 1848. But it was during the Great Hunger that changed social legislation, health schemes were to reorganize. During the 30 years of this period before the Great Hunger, cholera and typhus were the main two great menaces, but compared to two, typhus was worse. Because the cholera, even though was around from 1832 to 34 and again in 1839, it comes as quickly as it left. But typhus, although considered a poor man's disease, did linger among the poor. The government from London, even though at parts of the period had deficiencies, they did assume more responsibility for the poor, since the typhus epidemic and gradually increased until in 1822 it was almost government and medical institutions taking full responsibility to care for the state. Setting up committees during the typhus epidemic was similar to a previous epidemic of yellow fever, or otherwise known as Gibraltar sickness, which threatened the country after the Battle of Trafalgar. By developing a permanent Board of Health in 1820 and its acknowledgement of responsibility by the state, like its role to investigate and give relief to extreme cases. Social reforms were being introduced as a response against the widespread loss of life in future emergencies, but death occurred nonetheless. The social structure of Irish society was left unchanged, and the deep-rooted tragedy of the chronic poverty among the poor class had no acceptable solution. And that is all for today. So, Slán.